Welcome, everyone. My name is Michele Dunne. I'm the director of the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. Thank you for joining us for this event, North Africa Faces the Pandemic. What we're here to do today is to discuss, what issues that have come up in some videos, some mini documentaries that Carnegie has produced in collaboration with local filmmakers in North Africa about how the pandemic has affected vulnerable communities in 4 countries, in Morocco, Mauritania, Tunisia, and Egypt. And what we're going to do is we're going to screen very short versions of these documentaries. The documentaries themselves, all of which are available on our website, are about 10 minutes each. We're going to screen 2-minute versions of them to give you a taste. And then we're going to be speaking to experts on the region about what the documentaries show us about the economic, political, and social implications of the pandemic in North Africa. Our speakers today are going to be from the Carnegie Endowment, Rafiah Al-Talei, who is the acting editor-in-chief for Sada, our online publication that has published these videos, and 4 commentators. Intissar Fakir is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Institute's North Africa and Sahel program. She is an expert on North Africa, the Sahel, and key regional thematic issues, including governance, social change, migration, and security. Fatima Hadji. Fatima Hadji is a senior program officer covering Maghreb programs at the National Endowment for Democracy. Before joining the NED, she was a senior program officer at the National Democratic Institute, where she worked in the Middle East and North Africa division. Intissar Kherigi. Intissar Kherigi is a PhD student in political sociology at Sciences Po, Paris, where her research examines Tunisia's decentralization reforms between 2011 and 2019 and the reconfiguration of the relationship among state, society, and territory in the context of Tunisia's post-2011 political transition. And Timothy Caldas, who is a policy fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. His research focuses on transitional politics in Egypt, regime survival strategies, and Egyptian political economy and foreign policy. I'm really looking forward to hear what all of them have to say in reacting to these films. I also want right at the outset to thank Global Affairs Canada for their generous financial support for this project, for the production of these films. So what we're going to do, I'm going to turn first to Rafiah Al-Talei. Rafiah really oversaw this project at Carnegie, and I want to thank her for her work on these films, and she's going to describe the overall project and create the overall context for you of the pandemic in North Africa. Then we're going to screen the short films in the order of Morocco, Mauritania, Egypt, and Tunisia, and turn to each of the experts for their commentary. And then we will save the last portion of this hour for questions from all of you. Now, speaking of questions, let me say we will have a live Q&A session where you can ask questions about the last 15 to 20 minutes of this hour. To ask a question, use the live chat feature in YouTube or tweet us at Carnegie Endow using the hashtag #AskCarnegie. And then we will take your questions. So feel free to put in your questions throughout. Don't wait till the end of the hour. Put in your questions throughout, and then I'll take them in order at the end of the hour. So then I would like to give the floor to Rafiah Al-Talei to tell us more about this project. Rafiah, the floor is yours.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for all of you for coming, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this wonderful project, which I am very much proud of being part of it. But first, I would like to thank Intissar Fakir, who was in charge of these documentaries, which that are part of a bigger project funded and supported by Global Affair Canada. I am very happy I could work with such wonderful filmmakers. Professionally, they know what they do, and also they are so focused on human rights and they showed a lot of understanding how politics, economy, social issues are mixed and how they affect people's life. Basically, these four documentaries, although they look from different countries, from Morocco, Mauritania, Egypt, and Tunis, although they have one topic, main topic, which is the pandemic and how it's affected people, but also we learn too much from these documentaries beyond the pandemic, beyond the main topic they discuss. So while the Moroccan documentary express a general situation, but it also shows how that affect people's life, especially people work in the tourism sector, where people in Chefchaouen had to work in a different professions to support their families. And while we don't see a lot of personal life or social life, but we can imagine what kind of sacrifices these people made to support their families, to support their communities, and to hold in a job. Mauritania is more, focused maybe on women, and let us wonder and ask questions why women are more affected by economic crises or by any political issues. Women who work in very simple professions and businesses like couscousi sellers and beads makers, or women who are not classified, they are not registered in the officials, and so they are not supported during the pandemic. This Mauritania documentaries put the questions about gender. Women also in this documentary, they don't get not only the economic support, they don't get the health services as well. And they are left alone to tackle the problem of the pandemic. While Egypt documentary takes us deeply inside a person life, who is Nadia, who faced a lot of challenges during the pandemic. She lost her father, she lost her business, and she herself was infected by COVID-19. She explained for us how a woman live in a community that is not safe sometimes by going, when she goes outside in the street, she is harassed, she's a woman, she's weak, but at the same time, she again left alone to tackle the problems of her life and of her economy and raising a child. Tunis is, I always say each documentary, when I say it's my favorite, and then the other one comes and I think it's my favorite, but Tunis, it's actually the sum of all the other three documentaries. The Raja, the Tunisian woman who left alone, her husband left her because he lost his job. She lost her job, but she's still supporting her 4 kids, trying to do her best, but her husband left the family. Again, the question about gender, about women, why women, while the society think they are weak and always they need a support from maybe a male figure or other entities on the society, they also have to take the responsibility, the whole responsibility towards their families and toward themselves. For those of you who didn't see the documentaries, I recommend very much you go to Sada website. It's there, they are there in Arabic and English. They have English subtitles while the whole documentaries are in Arabic. I am very happy again that Sada produced these documentaries, and I think it's the first series in, inshallah, many series to come. Series that let people express their, their suffering, their thinking, and their also demands to the policymakers. Thank you.
كدوز في المدينه وكانك دايز في واحد اون فيل فونتوم. المحلات مسدوده، الحياه ما كايناش. حنا تاثرنا بشكل كبير كما باقي يعني المدن المغربيه وباقي يعني الاقامات والمطاعم والسلع التقليديه تاثرنا بشكل كبير.
كاين بزاف الناس كنعرفهم انا مثلا مشاو شي الله يحسن العون، شي مشى كيبيع ويشري مثلا في الخضره، شي باع مثلا الاله ديالو.
بالصحه والراحه. الحمد لله 15 سنه وانا في المجال ديال السياحه، وجات الظروف الحمد لله العالم كامل اللي كيعيش منا وكيعاني منا، وجعلتني انني نخدم في مجال اخر، ولكن الحمد لله على كل حال.
الوضع اللي وصلنا له دابا مؤلم، ماشي غير مؤسف، مؤلم جدا، لان كل ما كتبان واحد نقطه الضوء عاود كترجع تظلم من بعد.
السياحه ما كاينش والو، راه هاد اللي كانت هذه عام وزياده ما خدمناش والو، ما خدمناش يا سيدي.
من تداعيات ديال الازمه انها عجلت على القطاع الغير المهيكل. هناك سعي حثيث من طرف وزاره السياحه لان تشمل التغطيه الصحيه والضمان الاجتماعي جميع الفاعلين في القطاع السياحي.
I want to welcome Intissar Fakir, and I want to add my thanks to those of Rafiah. Intissar, you were, the originator of this project while you were at Carnegie, and you engaged some of the filmmakers who turned in such stellar work, including the filmmaker who made this film on Morocco. So I want to welcome your comments, Intissar, on the issue broadly of the pandemic in North Africa, in Morocco. I mean, this short version of the film just, it shows one particular place. But obviously there are much broader implications. And since you follow Morocco and the entire region so closely, please, let me give the floor to you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and thank you, Rafiah. I think really what Anas Mazzour, the filmmaker, did extremely well in this video, and I think really what the whole series does is it sort of gives a glimpse into the human dimension of the impact of the pandemic in marginalized regions through sort of an accessible and central sector here in Morocco, and that's the tourism sector, which accounts for about 5 to 7% of GDP of Moroccan economy, and which is really the principal way that most outsiders get to experience Morocco and, of course, any given place. But I think, for me, of course, the film appeals to me on a couple of different levels. As a scholar, as you mentioned, Michelle, I've been studying the impact of the pandemic. looking at how Maghreb economies are performing, GDP losses, looking at government policies, where governments have done well and where they have failed to respond effectively, and the broader impact that has on the population, increasing fragility among certain groups and social vulnerability. But I think the other element is really more human, and even sort of for me, it's more personal. I was born in Marrakesh and grew up in the old Medina of Marrakesh. And I really appreciate the way that the film sort of shows how lives are shaped by these circumstances, sort of, consolidating the human element and the policy element, which of course should always go hand in hand. But unfortunately, at times, especially at times of crises, they can seem separate. So first, I want to just briefly comment about the government response. And we heard in the film, Abdsalam, the narrator, and others talk about, government measures. And I think particularly initially, the Moroccan government did an overall good job, better than expected in terms of handling the pandemic. There were certainly shortcomings, but I think overall they focused on the right issues. At the offset, during sort of the early kind of health restriction measures, the government tried to offset those with some support. In this case, it was financial payments, like we heard in the documentary, service industry workers and tourism workers, including those in the informal sectors. They were able to receive monthly payments until, I think, the fall of 2020. The government also expanded basic medical coverage and is planning to expand Social Security coverage to all by 2025. Of course, in most cases, these payments and the support were not able to sustain many families, but they did help quite a lot. And I think another thing that the government did in the summer of 2020, particularly when the health restrictions were eased, they try to kind of think a little creatively about how to float the tourism sector. They did a little bit by encouraging domestic tourism, and this comes out in the longer version of the film. And I think this gave a bit of relief before the country went back into shutdown quickly after cases started to spike again. But I don't think the idea was ever to kind of replace international tourism here, because that's incomparable, as I mentioned early on. But it did give a little bit of a reprieve to some of the workers in these sectors. And of course, the government's vaccination campaign, I think it picked up, it really sort of picked up steam over the course of the spring and the fall. And I think we will see sort of, tourists coming back, barring, of course, any new variants or other disruptions as the epidemiological situation progresses. So I would say, the government's overall approach has been based really on two key elements: top down, and in this case, effective management. The palace closely managed the pandemic, empowering technocrats to handle this. And, my Carnegie colleagues, Nathan Brown and Yasmin Farouk, and I wrote about this trend of sort of empowering technocrats, especially early on in the pandemic. In this case, at least in the immediate term, it really made for more straightforward and effective management. Another thing is that the administration relied on international partners early on. Morocco has worked with international financial institutions to try and mitigate the impact of the crisis, especially ensuring financing for its recovery plans, because the government doesn't have a lot of money. So that's been crucial. Another important step is, of course, the early procurement of the vaccines and the vaccination campaigns, and that's been really crucial. And I think, according to IMF predictions, the tourism sector particularly is supposed to see a full recovery for 2021, and that will kind of contribute to Morocco's more optimistic economic recovery compared to its immediate neighbors. So just to kind of give a very brief example here before closing, the High Commission for Planning indicated already a pretty high rate for the second quarter, which is 12.6%, I think, in terms of recovery. So this is pretty encouraging for Morocco on the economy front. And then the last point that I want to make on sort of, kind of the human element here, which I really sort of found touching, just, stepping back after watching the movie, what I found rather poignant is this sort of nuance of artisans kind of questioning their own value and worth to the world, once tourism dried up. And for me, that really demonstrates this sort of kind of insidious combination of a tourism-based economy. You're basically really depending in every aspect of your life on this one sort of element of the economy, especially in these kind of still marginalized parts of the world. And on the other end, a pandemic that really makes that purely impossible. So it's sort of a dead end to that. So I think it's important to see that side of the pandemic, because although, we occasionally get these human interest stories in the media, in general, this has very much been a conversation about, government, economy, epidemiology, and we don't really get to see how these sort of daily lives in these kind of out of the way places like show. And I think that's a really valuable perspective. So I'm very glad that the documentary and that Anas and Rafiah and Carnegie were really able to bring that forward. So thank you guys for that.
Thanks, Intissar. I want to ask you a very quick follow-up. We're a little behind schedule, so I have to ask you to be really brief on this. Morocco recently had general elections, had parliamentary elections, and there's been a significant change with the PJD now not forming government and other parties stepping to the fore. Do you expect this to result in any significantly different approach to the economy or to socioeconomic issues, and to how the results of the pandemic are dealt with, or not really, because as you said, it's been largely technocrats have been, allowed to sort of do a lot of the planning?
Yeah, I mean, it's been technocrats, and I think what we will see in the next government is that these politicians that are very close to the monarchy and that are really sort of expected to implement the monarchy's vision, which is right now entirely encapsulated in the new development plan, which was launched earlier this year. So this new development model, it's a very ambitious, it's an extremely well thought out plan that really touches every aspect of the economy, including the tourism sector. But really the key here for this plan is going to be, I think, sort of figuring out a way to make sure that it doesn't fall victim to the same kind of lack of political will, lack of effective implementation that have plagued previously also, really good plans that Morocco has come up with. So I think that's going to really very much rest on the shoulders of this new government. They have the support of the monarchy. They have 100% the confidence of the monarchy. So let's see if they're going to be able to do this, or if it's going to be the same story as always,
Thanks, Intissar. We're going to move to the Mauritania film now. I just want to note one thing that you said, Intissar, about artisans who were, involved in producing for the tourism sector, questioning their value. That's a theme that comes out in the Mauritania film as well. I'm not sure how much it comes out in the 2-minute. It certainly comes out in the longer version. So we're going to go ahead and watch that one now.
كورونا أثر علينا وقفلوا باتشيزنا ولاتينا عندنا عمد نعدلوه ونحن الباتشي وقفلوا ونخلصوهم مودي الدولة ما طاتنا داعم وأدنى الله حاكم يجينا إذا كان مقفل ما لنا جابرين الشيء عند الدولة ولا لنا جابرين الشيء يشتغلون احنا أدنى الله قعود في الدار.
Moi, pratiquement, particulièrement, ça a impacté sur mon travail parce que le début, les émissions que je faisais à la radio, c'était arrêté.
Est-ce que vous allez prévoir, à part compilation,
الساعة اللي بدأت كورونا خارجين 5 أشهر تامين ما قد قاع حددت مسمار ولا قد تخلي شيء ما هو من شوي من هذا الخرز ونبيعه لأصحابات عندي ويقبضوه ويفوتوا شهر و2 ما خلصوني ويعطوني شيء ومنين يعطوني شيء هم اللي يقولوا عنهم ذاك الخرز يبقوا يزيدوه والله جبروا كمان ثاني منه.
بحسب دراسة للبنك الدولي فإن 28% من المشاركين في الدراسة الشخص الذي يعيل الأسرة تعطل في ظل الظرف الاقتصادي المتولد عن جائحة كورونا بشكل عام. أين وضع المرأة في هذا؟ وضع المرأة يعني أن المرأة التي كانت تشارك بشكل غير فاعل بالشكل المطلوب في الاقتصاد واجهت وضعية حكما وضعية إغلاق عام تأثر فيها جميع القطاعات خصوصا قطاع الخدمات.
I want to invite you, Fatima, to comment on the Mauritania film. I just want to note I've always been impressed at how much you are really taken with Mauritania and study it carefully and care about it. And you're writing a chapter on Mauritania for a book that Carnegie's putting out. So really interested to hear your comments about, you know, broadening the issue out. This film focuses very closely on the stories of several women and how the pandemic has affected their lives. I welcome your comments on that, as well as more broadly the economic, political, social environment in Mauritania during the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and I appreciate it. And thank you again for inviting me to participate. Those places that I showed in the video, actually, I've been there, and it's kind of, it's a very difficult reality. I think, in my view, Mauritania is a very complex country and in many different ways, because number one, of its fabric, social fabric, the number two, because of its location. It's kind of this country that is in a dilemma between the Maghreb and the Sahel. It's kind of tucked in. The video provides a glimpse of the reality of women during the pandemic, and particularly the economic challenges that they are facing, in addition to other challenges that they are facing, and that's an added burden. I think that particular video, even though we just saw of it right now, 2 minutes, gives us like the depiction of reality, leads us to think about the broader issues of gender inclusion, gender equality and equity and all that, in the broader sense of the context of the socioeconomic context of Mauritania, and also within the social fabric of Mauritania, because women not only they're facing these economic challenges, but within a context of slavery, the slavery, of course, historically been in Mauritania. So the profile of these women, like we have to look at those women in that context. The context also of gender, in a country that is conservative and nomadic as well. The context also of displacement, because also some of these women might have been actually returnees from the 1989 a kind of exodus to Senegal and coming back. So we have to look at that. So therefore we can actually conclude that the connecting the situation of women to the challenges of the pandemic also requires us to look at other issues and how they added to those challenges and the social issues. So also one of the important thing that I think the video did excellent, and I'm sure like in the longer version, it is the profile of these women in the informal sector. It's kind of the invisible, the invisible like segment of society, because those women, they don't benefit from any programs. If there are any programs to help them, they don't benefit socially, economically, and all. So we have to look at that as well. And also another thing, as I was looking at the profiles of these women, because Mauritania has a stratified society because of slavery, ethnic division, ethnic cleavages. I think one of the questions that I would like to know, and maybe hopefully one day will be explored, is the gender within, for example, for women in general in Mauritania. That's number one. And then gender issues within the minority groups, and then gender issues within the Haratin community, which is, there were former slaves, but they identify more of the Arab-speaking segments, and then women in the Afro-Mauritanian communities, and then women between urban and rural, a kind of approach, and then women and class. And in addition to that, women returnees, particularly if we delve into regions like Trarza and Brakna regions, where like the settlement of of women are like more there. So this is the questions that are really would be really interesting to further explore. Another item also is actually during the pandemic, Mauritania did benefit from international help, and a lot of the international donors, for instance, they had to reprogram some of their their aid to basically deal with the pandemic and the socioeconomic and the economic issues within Mauritania. But the question remains: who benefited from these services and this aid, and who is responsible for that? So that brings another element of corruption that is Mauritania also is known for. And also we have to also look at all of these issues within the fact that Mauritania, like for example, the 2020 Human Development Index, Mauritania ranks at 157 out of 188 countries. So it is a kind of a composite of issues that are affecting Mauritania, let alone women. So it's kind of continuous double marginalization. Another, the interesting thing too in this thing is that actually Mauritania has a strategy called the SCAP strategy, which is, in France, the strategy for, a strategy for shared prosperity, which is 2016 to 2030. So, and one of the pillars of that particular strategy is actually women inclusion and gender and economic growth of women. So the question is like from 2016 until now, what happened? So what is hindering the issue, a women's prosperity, women's economic empowerment, particularly those women who are in the margins of society? So that's a question again, and we can link all of that to government policies. We can link on that to the fact that the strategy is on paper, but not on it doesn't. How does it apply in practice? We can link that to issues of corruption in the broader sense. I don't know how much time.
Fatima, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to cut you off. We're past the halfway mark, and we still have two more comments to do.
My thing is that the question of gender is always important to be explored in Mauritania.
Well, and I'm really glad you brought it out, because actually the next two documentaries we're going to watch, the one on Egypt and the one on Tunisia, also focus on women, and these two tell a little bit more of a personal story of one woman and one family, and then broaden out to the issues of the pandemic. So I think I'd like to go ahead and move to the Egypt film now, and Fatima, I welcome more comments from you when we get into the discussion portion. But thank you very much for bringing out the gender issues. We really hope that these documentaries do that well. So let's go ahead and watch the mini version of the Egypt documentary now.
Thank you, Michelle.
يوم وفاة بابا أنا واقفة في المستشفى وأكتشف إن أنا البنت الكبيرة اللي لازم تاخد بقى قرارات. أكتشف إن ظهري اتكسر. نكتشف بقى إن عادل حكيم ده كان شايل عنا كتير.
أنت اللي بتحميني من كل الشرور ماسك بيميني.
أنا نادية بنت القسيس عادل حكيم، قسيس كنيسة صغيرة في مركز مغاغة في شمال المنيا. عندي 32 سنة. بنتي عندها 5 سنين ونص. أنا ست في مجتمع الكلمة الأولى والأخيرة فيه للراجل. مسيحية في مجتمع الأغلبية بتاعته مسلمين. إنجيلية في وسط مجتمع كله أرثوذكسي صعيدية في مجتمع المركزية بتاعته في القاهرة وبحري، ست منفصلة سنجل ماذر في مجتمع بيحرم على الست المسيحية أي نوع من أنواع الانفصال. أنا خضت معارك كبيرة جدا في سنتين الكورونا، تحديات عظيمة جدا في حياتي، وأكبر تحدي فيهم هو فقداني لسندي وظهري القسيس عادل الحكيم. فقدت بابا، وساعتها مش فارق قوي أنا عايشة فين ولا قاعدة فين، كل اللي فارق إني وأنا بعمل كل الحاجات دي بابا مش موجود في حياتي، وتحول بابا لشوية صور وفيديوهات بنفتحها ونضحك، وأوقات كتير بنعيط عشان هو وحشنا قوي.
Wow, that film raises so many interesting issues, not only gender issues, but I would say intersectionality and the vulnerability of people who may be marginalized in several different ways, and how the pandemic can affect them disproportionately. So I'm really delighted to invite Tim Caldas, someone whose work on Egypt, on political economy, as well as social issues, I respect very much. Tim, I welcome your comments. Please unmute yourself and give us, your thoughts on the film and how it translates to broader issues relating to Egypt now.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michelle. I think I really encourage you all to watch the full length documentary. It's 20 minutes and it's really rich. Nedia's circumstances are really quite exceptional on a number of levels. I'm glad that they focused on a family that lives in Minya, because a lot of the emphasis in discussion about Egypt tends to focus on Egypt and to a lesser extent Alexandria. We don't really hear much about the rural periphery, and Minya is also very important for a number of reasons. One of them being that it is the poorest governorate in Egypt. Poverty levels there exceed 60% of the population, which is roughly double the national poverty rate. So it's an area that without a pandemic is already struggling a great deal in terms of people finding livelihoods. Many people are forced to migrate to Cairo to work. And of course, Nedia, as she so eloquently put it, is a minority within a minority within a minority in a really intense way. I think that her struggle captured a lot of things that are both specific to Egypt and that we've seen globally. So rural periphery areas have at times been under-resourced in Egypt and elsewhere in terms of health provision, in terms of the number of ICU beds that are available and the quality of care that people can receive. Minya is no exception. When the pandemic started, our knowledge of how it was affecting rural areas was pretty thin. And admittedly, the data, even in urban centers in Egypt, is highly unreliable. And by the admission of the government itself, they're undercounting by a pretty substantial amount. So there's that element of it. But on top of that, if you watch the rest of the film, you'll see her discuss the fact that she was lucky that she had moved out of a very densely populated area in Minya to a middle-class part of Cairo that allowed for her to be among neighbors who were taking more precautions and observing certain hygienic precautions and social distancing and things of that nature that kept her safer. And unfortunately, a lot of Egyptians live in circumstances that don't really allow for social distancing. There's a huge crowding challenge. There's a lot of poverty, which forces people to go out and look for work. And this whole stay-at-home thing is not really an option for most Egyptians, of course, in ways that poverty has forced a lot of workers in many parts of the globe to be to take a much heavier hit when it comes to infections and deaths. I think what we saw in Egypt at the beginning of the pandemic was an attempt by the government to really take this quite seriously. We saw closure of the airports. We saw closure of universities and schools. We saw quarantining of returning Egyptians for 14 days in hotels, initially paid for by the government. And then slowly we see kind of a fading of those support services. And there's, I mean, some structural reasons why that had to happen on some of those issues, but then there's also governance failures that explain other ones. So for example, the reality is that most Egyptians can't afford to stay home for any extended period of time. And the government has not built an infrastructure that allows it to effectively give cash assistance to large sections of the population, even if it had the financial resources. So for example, they had a fund where they were offering informal workers $30 a month support, 500 Egyptian pounds. And by the government's own admission, a very small fraction of informal workers actually ever successfully got a hold of that funding. Many of them were unaware of the fact that it was available, didn't know how to access it. There were major communication breakdowns that, again, forced people to put themselves in more precarious situations than they might otherwise have. We also see an issue of disorganization in the vaccine program in Egypt. So for example, they quickly opened it up to everybody without prioritizing vulnerable groups. And so that led to a situation where 20-year-olds were getting vaccinated before 80-year-olds, and the vaccine centers themselves have workers who aren't wearing masks in many cases. I know we're out of time, so I'm going to leave it at that for now, but I'm happy to discuss this further.
Thank you, Tim. And like I said, hopefully you can come back in on the discussion. But you know, it really, the pandemic has, all over the world, of course, exposed vulnerabilities, right, in the social system and in the social safety net. And we're certainly seeing that really comes out in this film a lot. You know, this woman says her father was it. He was her social safety net. Anyway, we're going to move on now to watch the Tunisia film.
وبعد أشهر من الحديث عن الجائحة والجائحة تزداد استفحالا حتى صارت تونس في المرتبة الأولى في أفريقيا وفي الوطن العربي.
مدام راجع العقربي، عاملة من عمال السياحة، عاملة طوابق، خدمت في عدة نزل، حاليا عاطلة عن العمل من اللي صارت الكوفيد، وراجلي كان يخدم في الصالون، ويني كنت نخدم في الأوتيل. كانت شهريتي مستورة الحمد لله، وشهرية راجلي عايشين، فهمت الحمد لله لاباس. عندي 4 صغار يقراو، كل يقراو. جاء الوباء هذايا بطلنا الزوز، قعدنا في الدار، هو نقصوه من خدمته ويني نقصوني من خدمتي، وبدات تدهور امورنا بشويه بشويه. صغاري كانوا يعيشوا بيان وكانوا يعيشوا ياكلوا مليح، ولينا ساعه ما نعجز باش نشري فطور الصباح، وليت ساعات ما عادش نقدر باش نطيب فطور نص نهار. 250 حق الخبزه، اقسم بالله حق خبزه انا عندي معناها، وصلت حق خبزه ما عنديش. نكردي من حوانت، تراكمت عليا الديون ديجا، راني حوانت الكل مازالوا يسالوني. فما حانوت من عاملاه ولي سني 350 دينار كريدي ماكله. تعبت. اول حاجه هي تبدلت هي المعامله بيني وبين راجلي، كي اني قعدت بطاله ولت كثرت علي المسؤوليه ورزنت عليه، فهمت. وعندي مشاكل اني وراجلي ديجا هارب، عنده 7 شهور ماهوش يصرف على صغاره، وعندنا قضيه في الطلاق تو بيني وبين وراجلي سببها هي الكوفيد، وخلاني وحدي. يقول لك صغيرك راني جيعانه، نخرج ندور في الشارع كالمهبوله، نبدا نقرق بالعباد. بربي راني ما عنديش باش نطيب العشاء اليوم، بربي اني وصلت رجال كاو قدامي صحابي خدموا معايا، يبكي راجل يبكي. وصلت تاني عندي 10,000 فرنك نقسمها اني وياه، قول له ما تبكيش، معناها احنا لبعضنا رحمنا لبعضنا، دولتنا ما رحمتنيش. هاي
You know, as you can see, and the Tunisia documentary tells a personal story, and and a very painful and touching one. It also does, you know, a good job of connecting, especially if you watch the longer one, connecting her personal story to the broader political issue in Tunisia, and to the fact that, you know, help from the government is not reaching this woman, you know, this family in which both partners lost their jobs. So let's see, I would love to bring in Intissar Kherigi for her comments. Intissar, if you can unmute, please, perhaps we can hear you, and hopefully turn on your camera too. Even if you can't do that, at least we can hear you.
Yes, I've got my camera turned on, so hopefully you can all see me. Yeah, I mean, that video was really painful to watch. It's just one story among thousands and hundreds of thousands of Tunisians who are. I'm sorry, my camera's actually on. I'm not sure what's going on.
Let's just go ahead and speak, Intissar. Hopefully it will come on, but at least we can hear your comments.
Okay, well, I can see myself on the screen. I'm not sure if everyone else can, but really, I mean, the tourism sector, which the lady in the video was working in, has been the hardest hit, or among the hardest hit. And it is particularly heartbreaking because the tourism industry was just starting to get back on track after the revolution. You know, in 2018-19, the numbers were back up to pre-revolution numbers, particularly after the 2015 terrorist attacks, which, you know, were devastating for the hotel industry and for tourism overall. And the tourism sector contributes 10% of the jobs in the country. And of course, the hardest hit have been the poorest and most vulnerable households, which tend to be concentrated in the center, west, and the southeast regions. So a lot of those who are working in the tourism industry are coming from other regions where there are not many jobs available, and coming to the coastal regions. So they already have, you know, they are insecure in the sense that they are renting. They don't have, you know, their own property. Most of the contracts in the tourism sector, many of them are informal. And so you have a real problem in terms of working conditions, in terms of social protection. And we see also the fact that women have been disproportionately affected. You know, it's both her and her husband were going through this situation, but unfortunately, she's been the one left with the responsibility. And women have really experienced the crisis a lot more deeply than men. Women are more likely to be employed without a contract. They're more likely to be in seasonal and casual work, and they're less likely to have access to social security. And female agricultural workers as well, we saw played a really critical role, you know, during the pandemic in terms of preserving food security. But they suffer from particularly bad working conditions. They represent around 58% of agricultural workers are women, but they represent only 4% of landowners. And they face a wage gap, which is often, you know, they receive half the pay of men in terms of the daily wage. And so they have been particularly affected. And those who, you know, are working in the informal sector, those who have no contract, they have no access to social security. And so we saw that the government did introduce some bold measures right at the start of the pandemic. So in March 2020, there was an emergency plan, which was really focusing on two main things. It was focusing on preserving jobs, so supporting businesses to weather the storm. And secondly, to really focus assistance on the poorest and most vulnerable households. So in terms of the first, in terms of supporting businesses, the government actually supported businesses to pay part of their salary costs for a short period of time. There was also postponement of taxes and social security contributions, all of that. But we find, I think somebody else was mentioning also before, we find that there is a problem in terms of information, access to information. And we find that only 10% of companies who were surveyed recently in a government study had actually benefited from these measures. So there is the issue actually of not just these measures, but how to communicate them and how to make sure that they are accessible to businesses and to entrepreneurs. In terms of the assistance to the poorest households, unfortunately, we've seen a reverse actually of the improvements that have been made in terms of reducing the poverty rate in Tunisia. So the poverty rate had been brought down from about 25% to about 15%. between 2000 and 2015, but that has now been reversed as we see that child poverty and poverty overall has increased. And so there's been a big push, a big focus on cash transfer programs, which have been supported by various international donors as well, to provide families with a little bit of help, and not very much, up to 200 dinars a month, which is about $70, not very much at all. These measures have reached around 1.1 million people, but really, these are short-term measures. The state does not have the resources, unfortunately, to be able to continue these measures for very long. So there is a real question about how to, change the economic model so that we are actually producing decent jobs, and decent jobs mean those that actually pay decent wages, which is not the case, unfortunately, at present, and which also provide some form of security. And we heard Intissar earlier talking about Morocco in terms of an economic or new development model. And it's the same in Tunisia. We have this constant debate about how to change the development model, and how to really overcome the structural problems that are plaguing the economy. And the main issues really are in terms of complex systems of restrictions on entrepreneurship, and really subjecting economic activity to a lot of administrative authorizations, which are not there actually to regulate for the benefit of consumers and for the benefit of the public, but really to enable the state to decide who can and cannot engage in economic activity. And there is a whole system of opaque and discretionary procedures that allow, states, institutions to essentially screen and exclude those who are, not cozy enough with, bureaucrats and with political elites. And so I think that there is a real question. I think it's interesting that all these countries are facing the same problems, but the debates are different according to the different political system. And so the debate in Tunisia has been about what kind of political system is going to deliver the prosperity that we need. Because we see that Tunisia has been on the road to democracy for 10 years. And actually, if we look at democratization, Tunisia has done very well. If you look at measures that are to do with classical procedural democracy. So if you take, for example, the world governance indicators, which look at, for example, freedom of expression and association, free and fair elections, a free media, etc. Tunisia was actually on course to have the fastest political transition to democracy in history. And so, setting up institutions and all of that has gone very well. But the question is, how do those institutions actually, how do they have enough power and enough sort of cohesion to be able to actually undertake deep and fundamental reforms? And all the studies that we are seeing show that economic power, we've seen political power has fragmented, so and decentralized. So we don't have as much centralization of political power in the hands of a president or one party, as was the case under Ben Ali. But economic power remains very much unchanged since the revolution, and remains concentrated in the hands of a few family groups who really use their access to the political sphere to be able to consolidate their resources and to keep out other actors. So the question in Tunisia, I think, which might be different from other countries, is how do we actually change the economic system, and how can democracy at the same time not just provide us with freedom, but actually provide us with a prosperity and dignified living conditions.
Thank you, Intissar. I'd like to actually bring all the panelists back up on the screen if we could briefly. We are, unfortunately, we're almost at the end of the hour. We're not going to, but I am going to take one question that's come in from a number of people and let each of you give a 1-minute answer, okay? And actually, we'll start with you, Intissar Kherigi, since we left off with you. And the question is this: several people have asked, like, how have the governance challenges that we see in the pandemic, how are they related to governance from before the pandemic? I mean, with the challenges that we're seeing now, with people falling through the social safety net and suffering these, devastating personal and family and sectoral consequences, how much are these related to problems that were already there? Okay, and to what extent is there an opportunity now because of the pandemic to address those issues in a different way? Okay, so I'm going to come back to each of you in reverse order, starting with you, Intissar Kherigi.
Right. So certainly, I think that many of these countries are facing problems that have built up over a number of decades. And failure to actually reform and address these issues at the time. And so in Tunisia, the revolution was essentially the expression of a crisis. And it wasn't the end of that crisis. It was really this sort of eruption and unfolding of multiple crises at the same time. So there was an economic crisis that was already underway from the 2000s, actually. And we saw numerous uprisings in the country around economic issues throughout the 2000s. But also institutional crises and political crises. And so, this is the reason why there is so much interest in talking about a new development model, because the interest in changing the regime was essentially about freedom and dignity is about those very substantive issues. And I think that, successive elections have shown that Tunisians want to have the state involved. They want state-led development. They want the presence of the state in marginalized regions. But the question is really the relationship between state and business. How do you get the private sector to actually play its role in driving growth? And how do you tackle the system of sort of parasitic cronyism, which is that, unless you're in league with the state institutions and bureaucrats, and sort of harvesting these government rents, then you are not able to actually advance and you're not able to grow. And that's why we have an economic system which is very unbalanced. You have what's called the missing middle, that you have either very large companies which are politically connected, or you are a small company that is unable to grow because you can't get the access to markets and to finance due to this political system. And so I think governance is essential and central to the debate here.
Thank you, Intissar. Tim, Caldas, I'm going to turn this to you. And I think a lot of what Intissar just said also could be applied to Egypt. Unmute, please.
Absolutely. Egypt also has a missing middle problem. Amr Adli just wrote a book about it that just came out this last year. The reality is, I think a lot of the governance failures that Egypt had going into the uprising in 2011 have, if anything, been exacerbated in recent years. And when you have a government that doesn't have accountability, that isn't transparent, that is actively disinforming the public all the time through its media outlets, when you come into a health crisis where transparency, information, responsiveness are so vital in order to be effective, it's going to impair their ability to offer an effective response. And it's going to impair their ability to compel the public to trust them. Which is vitally important in a time like this, and they have good reason to be cynical about the instructions coming from the state, and all of this has played a role in exacerbating the pandemic, coupled with the fact that Egypt's economic reforms have been built on this idea of if we cut subsidies and have targeted cash transfers, we can be more efficient. But we cut the subsidies, and our cash transfer system is still extremely anemic and misses half of the population living in poverty. And so the absence of that infrastructure made any sort of support for people in need during the pandemic all but impossible, because you can't just build it all of a sudden. And so Egypt came into this with a lot of handicaps, and it has affected its ability to protect people, which is why there's a substantial death toll despite the official figures.
Thank you, Tim. I know we're past the noon hour, but we're going to go 5 more minutes just to allow our last 3 panelists a minute or so to pitch in. Fatima, your turn.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief. Broadly, I think that, in my view, also the response to the question is that the pandemic highlighted already existing problems. It just brought them to the surface. They're structural, and also it highlighted that there is a lack of genuine reforms that take into account, particularly in the socioeconomic realm, because all the reforms are done and as a piecemeal. And also, if we zoom into women, I think there is a lack of a women's role, like effective role in policy making, and we can debate this until knows what, but that's the truth. And I think so the question is that what we can do to move forward so that women will have a voice in the policy making for a better economic situation and socioeconomic empowerment as well. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you.
Intissar Fakir, your turn.
Thank you.
Hey, Michelle. So I think maybe in terms of Morocco, the same thing. I think that I agree with pretty much everything that Timothy said and that Intissar said, but I just want to focus a little bit on the economy. I think for Morocco, there's what the pandemic really highlighted is that in terms of economic reform, what the government has focused on probably over the past, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years, is really trying to address sort of big macroeconomic indicators. So the focus has been on improving those, trying to address budget deficit by cutting subsidies, by lowering the wage bill, so making the public sector smaller, really trying to focus on this at the expense of investing in people and at the expense of ensuring that vulnerable segments of society are supported, that people are invested in, so that you have kind of a more sort of robust and kind of prosperous society. And I think this is what's coming into focus right now, not just during the pandemic, but also I would argue like long before that, with all of the protests that we saw since 2011, ongoing protests, 2016 in Morocco in the Rif region, is that there is, we're now kind of seeing that this sort of focus has to shift a little bit, and that all of these countries really have to think about how to build more inclusive economies that respond to the need of the more sort of marginalized societies. And that's, I think, a shared sort of challenge. And we see in the post-pandemic period how everybody is sort of trying to figure out a way to respond to it, right? So Morocco has their own kind of, new development model. Algeria is trying desperately to, try to figure out a way of how to diversify away from oil and really kind of open up the economy a little bit more. Tunisia, I think most of that right now is focused on how, what the president is going to do, and if he alone somehow can come up with some miraculous solution to the economy. And of course, in Egypt, and what we heard about in Mauritania as well. I think the new president in Mauritania, Ghazouani, really has these sort of very ambitious plans about how to address some of these structural challenges that Fatima has talked about. But the problem is that he wants to address, I think, the manifestation of them, not sort of the core of them, which goes right to the heart of how the whole political and economic system is set up. So, we'll see. There are some good initiatives. There are some sort of, weak initiatives. There are no initiatives. There are some completely unrealistic initiatives. So we'll see how things kind of play out over the next couple of years, which really make this region all the more dynamic and crucial to watch.
Thanks, Intissar, and thanks again for your role in originating the series. Rafiah, the last word to you. Unmute.
Thank you very much. And I want only to stress one point, that this discussion, in fact, proves for us that we as a think tank, Carnegie, I think we should consider documentaries and videos as one tool of, our maybe research, because they first make people voices heard, and so whether by public or the general public or by the policy makers, and also it initiates such important discussion like the one we have today. I would like again to thank you all for very deep and analytical discussion, and I am very proud to be part of this discussion, as I am proud of being part of the making of the documentaries.
Thank you, Rafiah, for your role. Thanks to all of the panelists. I also want to thank our program coordinator, Madison Andrews, for arranging and running this session. And I want to thank all the participants for being with us and encourage you all to go and watch the longer versions of these films, either at our webpage at carnegieendowment.org/Sada or on Facebook. Thanks for being with us and have a great day. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.